Imagine coming back to the land your family left you, expecting peace, maybe a fresh start, only to be met with someone who thinks they run the place. That's exactly what happened to me. I had just inherited my family's property, a piece of land with a small cabin and a whole lot of memories, but the moment I set foot on it, I was confronted by a woman who had no idea who I was. She introduced herself as the HOA president and wasted no time telling me I didn't belong there. From the way she looked at me, you'd think I had trespassed onto her personal estate. At first, I thought maybe she was mistaken, that she didn't realize this property was never part of her HOA. But it didn't matter what I said. She was convinced she was in charge and made it clear she wanted me gone. She shouted about rules, about how my cabin was against community standards, and even tried to order me off my own driveway. The nerve of it almost left me speechless. Almost. What she didn't know, and what made this situation even sweeter, was that the land she was standing on, the very land her HOA loved to control, was mine now. Every inch of it. Not only did I inherit the property, but through some overlooked agreements, I had become the one person she'd never expect her new landlord. Her smug confidence started to crack the moment I pulled out the paperwork. You could see it in her face, shock, disbelief, and maybe even a little fear. But that was just the beginning. Because when Karen realized she wasn't in charge anymore, the real drama started. And trust me, you won't believe how far she went when the tables turned. Karen stood there frozen, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't process what she had just heard. The driveway that she so proudly declared community property was in fact part of the land deed I held in my hands. She wasn't ready to accept that truth. Instead of backing down, she doubled down. She kept insisting that the HOA had control, that their rules applied, and that I would be forced to comply whether I liked it or not. The funny part is, I hadn't even planned on getting tangled in HOA drama. My plan was simple: come back to the land my grandfather left me, fix up the old cabin, and spend some time reconnecting with my roots. The place was peaceful, tucked just outside the neighborhood, and technically separate from any HOA authority. But somewhere along the years, Karen and her board must have convinced themselves they had full power over it. She didn't just treat me like an outsider, she treated me like a trespasser on my own property. As I walked her through the boundary markers and explained how the land had been in my family for decades, her eyes narrowed. She didn't want to hear history or facts. She wanted control. And the more calm I stayed, the more she raised her voice, as though volume could erase my ownership papers. What made it worse was the way neighbors started gathering at the edge of the road, whispering and watching. Some seemed entertained, while others clearly supported her. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just about land or rules. Karen had built her identity around being the one in charge. And now, with me standing there as the rightful owner and new landlord, her entire image was cracking. And trust me, she wasn't about to let that go without a fight. Karen didn't just stop at arguing with me in the driveway. Within a few days, she escalated things in ways I never imagined. I started getting letters slipped under my cabin door, printed notices with the HOA logo stamped across the top. Each one demanded fines for violations that made no sense, like improper landscaping, unapproved renovations, and even failure to maintain curb appeal. The kicker? My cabin wasn't even on their official HOA map. Yet somehow, she was determined to drag me into their web of rules. Neighbors started approaching me quietly, almost in whispers, sharing their own stories of Karen's control. One man admitted she once fined him for parking his truck too close to the sidewalk, even though it was his own driveway. Another woman said Karen reported her to the city for having a bird feeder that supposedly attracted undesirable wildlife. The more I listened, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about me. Karen had been ruling the neighborhood with fear for years. But there was another layer to this mess. Buried in the paperwork I inherited was a set of agreements my grandfather had made decades ago. Not only did I own the cabin and surrounding land, but I also had certain rights over shared spaces the HOA loved to control, like the trail leading to the lake and the dock everyone used for fishing. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces started fitting together. Karen wasn't just mad about me moving in, she was terrified of losing her grip on the very places that gave her power. Still, the more I uncovered, the more dangerous the situation felt. Every step I took to prove my rights only seemed to push Karen further toward desperation. And deep down, I knew her next move wasn't going to be as simple as another letter. It didn't take long for things to spiral into something bigger than just heated words and warning letters. One evening, I came home to find a group of HOA board members gathered at the edge of my driveway, clipboards in hand. Karen stood in the middle, arms crossed, acting like she was presiding over some courtroom. They started pointing at my cabin, jotting notes, whispering among themselves as if they were preparing a case against me. It wasn't just intimidation. It felt like they were planning something. The tension spread through the neighborhood. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, afraid to get involved, while others secretly nodded at me in support. One elderly couple even slipped me a folder of old newsletters and meeting notes that showed just how far Karen had gone to bend the rules in her favor. It was eye-opening but also chilling. She had a history of twisting community bylaws to corner anyone who challenged her. And now I was her biggest threat. The pressure built day by day. Mysterious cars started parking near the property at night, headlights lingering a little too long before driving off. I'd hear footsteps along the trail to the lake, even though no one should have been there that late. It was as if Karen was trying to make me feel like an outsider on my own land, pushing me to crack under the weight of her games. The breaking point came when I received a formal notice taped to my cabin door, this time not just a fake fine, but an eviction order claiming I was in violation of HOA regulations. My hands shook as I read it, not from fear, but from disbelief. Karen was no longer bluffing. She was taking the fight to a level that would force everything out into the open. And that's when the real showdown began to feel inevitable. I stared at the so-called eviction notice, still stuck to my door with tape. It was bold, even for Karen, but what shocked me more was the official-looking seal at the bottom. At first glance, it looked like a city stamp, but something about it felt off. When I compared it to actual county paperwork the differences were clear. Karen had gone as far as forging documents to make her threats look real. That's when I realized this was no longer just a personal feud. She was willing to cross serious. The next morning, I went down to the local records office to verify everything. Sure enough, my land and cabin were completely separate from the HOA's jurisdiction. But here's where the twist hit me. In digging deeper, I found out the HOA had actually been leasing part of my family's land for years, using it for their community events by the lake. The lease had expired months ago, and with me as the new owner, they had no legal right to step foot there anymore. Which meant every barbecue, every HOA meeting by the dock, every gathering they bragged about had been happening on land that belonged to me. It was the perfect leverage, but it also explained Karen's desperation. If word got out that the HOA had been trespassing and collecting dues for access to land they didn't own, her entire position as president would crumble. Suddenly, her aggressive behavior wasn't just about me moving in, it was about protecting her image and keeping this secret buried. Standing there with the documents in hand, I realized the stakes had just doubled. This wasn't only a fight for my right to live on my land. Now, I was holding the power to expose Karen and shake the very foundation of her HOA kingdom. And she had no idea I knew. When Karen showed up at my cabin again, this time with half the HOA board in tow, I knew the moment had come. She waved the fake eviction notice in the air, shouting that I had 24 hours to leave. But instead of arguing, I calmly pulled out my own stack of papers, the land deeds, the expired lease, and copies of her forged notice. The crowd that gathered around us went silent as I laid it all out. Every eye turned to Karen, waiting for her response. Her confidence cracked the second I explained that not only was my cabin outside the HOA's control, but that their beloved lakefront gatherings had been held illegally on my land for months. Gasps rippled through the neighbors. Karen's face turned red, her voice trembling as she tried to deny it, but the paperwork spoke louder than her words ever could. Just when I thought she might back down, Karen made one last desperate move. She claimed the lease had automatically renewed and tried to spin the story, but that's when a neighbor, one of the quiet supporters, stepped forward holding an old newsletter. It clearly announced the lease expiration date. The truth was undeniable. The HOA had no rights, and Karen had been misleading everyone. The board members started whispering among themselves, stepping away from her, realizing the mess she had dragged them into. It felt like victory, but then came the twist. One of the board members admitted Karen had been collecting extra maintenance fees from residents, claiming it was to keep up the lake property. None of that money had ever been accounted for. In that moment, the story flipped completely. Karen wasn't just wrong about me, she had been exposed to her own community. And suddenly, I wasn't the one on trial anymore. She was. The silence that followed was almost heavier than the shouting had been. Karen tried to speak, but her own board members had already turned their backs on her. One by one, they walked away, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the driveway. Neighbors who had once followed her lead now whispered to each other, realizing they had been paying into a system built on lies. Some looked relieved, others looked angry, but all of them knew the truth was finally out. I didn't need to rub it in. The documents, the evidence, and the voices of the neighbors had done that for me. Karen stormed off, muttering under her breath, but without the support of her board or her community, her power was gone. For the first time since stepping foot back on my inherited land, I felt like I could finally breathe. The HOA quickly reorganized without her, and several neighbors even came by to thank me for standing my ground. Some admitted they had been too scared to challenge Karen, but seeing her exposed gave them the courage to finally speak up. The lake and the trails were once again open for everyone to enjoy, this time with permission, not fear. As I settled back into life on my property, I couldn't help but think about how close I'd come to walking away when the pressure got heavy. Instead, I learned that standing firm, knowing your rights, and refusing to be bullied can turn the tide in your favor. At the end of it all, my grandfather's land became more than just an inheritance. It became a reminder that truth has a way of shining through, no matter how tightly someone tries to control it. And for me, that was the most valuable part of the fight.